Welcome to the deep dive. You've given us, well, a really challenging set of sources today. It's all centered on this deeply unsettling true crime case involving 7-month-old Emanuel Harrow in Riverside County, California.
Yeah, it's a case that's just built on this foundation of devastating contradiction.
Mm.
It kicked off with that very public, very emotional plea from the parents, Rebecca and Jake Harrow.
Right, outside that Big Five parking lot.
Exactly. They presented this narrative that was really designed for maximum sympathy. Rebecca claimed she'd been, knocked unconscious while changing Emmanuel's diaper, and that the baby was just snatched, violently taken.
And that image, I remember seeing it, the anguish, the supposed randomness and brutality of a public abduction, that's what everyone initially took in. The media, the community.
Absolutely. But the real focus for us here, looking at these investigative reports and legal analysis you provided, is how investigators, well, how quickly they saw the cracks in that story.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to trace how that happened, how the police went from a kidnapping alert to realizing it was all a performance.
Precisely. We're following the path that uncovered this,
Mm-hmm.
this calculated fabrication. A story designed, ultimately, to hide sustained child abuse and murder.
It's crucial then for you listening to understand the layers here, the deceit involved.
Yeah, we need to look at the background, the systemic failures that allowed Jake Harrow to harm another child. We'll examine the quick legal moves, the psychology between the parents, which is fascinating and disturbing.
And that ongoing, incredibly difficult search for Emmanuel's remains.
Right. Because the truth here wasn't like a sudden confession. It wasn't coaxed out easily. It was pieced together by investigators who were meticulously focusing on everything that just didn't make sense. The contradictions.
Okay, let's start at the beginning of this charade. The staged police, that was August 14th, 2025. You see the footage, Jake Harrow, he looks completely broken, tears streaming down his face.
Repeating the story over and over. His wife assaulted, their infant son stolen, begging for Emmanuel's safe return.
It's a powerful image, designed, you'd have to assume, to deflect any suspicion away from them.
Absolutely. A textbook performance, really. But law enforcement realized pretty fast that the script, well, it didn't match the actual scene, the physical evidence or lack thereof.
So the shift from missing child alert to a homicide investigation happened quickly.
Very quickly.
Yeah.
It was driven by things that were just physically and circumstantially impossible according to their story.
What were those immediate red flags, the things that just shattered that illusion almost right away?
Well, investigators pointed to three main things based on these sources. First, the surveillance footage. They pulled everything they could from the Big Five parking lot surrounding businesses.
Standard procedure, I imagine.
Right. But when they mapped the couple's timeline, the exact moments Rebecca claimed she was changing the diaper, the supposed struggle, the attacker escaping it, just didn't line up with any of the camera angles. There was this conspicuous lack of activity, a silence where a violent fight should have been.
Okay, so the video didn't back them up. What was the second point?
Witnesses. I mean, if there's a violent struggle in a public parking lot, you'd expect someone, somewhere nearby, to hear something, see something, a scream, a car speeding off.
Anything.
Exactly. But the witnesses they interviewed, people who were in the area, people who passed by that specific empty parking space they pointed out, nobody recalled any struggle. No commotion, no panic shouts, nothing.
So that empty parking space, instead of being evidence of a crime scene.
It became a silent contradiction. Its emptiness, its lack of any disruption, actually argued against their story. It's just maybe a normal departure, not a scene of violence.
And the third point, this one seems maybe the most visually damning. It was about Rebecca Harrow herself. She had that very visible black eye during the press conference.
Yes, and they presented it as proof. Proof she was struck, knocked out during the abduction. But this is where the forensic analysis really started to pick the story apart. Experts, like the commentator Julie Grant mentioned in the sources, looked at that bruise and noted it didn't appear fresh.
What does fresh mean in terms of bruising?
Well, bruises change color over time, right? They start reddish, then go purple and blue within a day or two, and then fade to green and yellow as they heal over a week or more.
Okay.
The bruise Rebecca showed. It was apparently already starting to yellow slightly around the edges. It looked several days old.
Which immediately raises questions.
Huge questions. It suggested the injury wasn't from the supposed parking lot assault on August 14th. It pointed to pre-existing trauma, something that happened earlier.
So the very proof they offered
Became evidence against them. It indicated that not only did the injury happen before the staged event, but that maybe some conflict had already occurred within the household.
Yeah.
And worse, that they deliberately incorporated that old bruise into the fake abduction story to make it seem more credible.
Wow. That level of calculation is chilling.
It is, and that's why the police moved so fast. They realized the crime wasn't the abduction. The crime was the abuse that led to Emanuel's death, and then this coordinated, elaborate cover-up.
So within days, they're both arrested, charged with murder, and also filing a false police report.
Yes, and the Riverside County DA's office was very clear about the basis for the murder charge.
What did they emphasize?
They stated their belief wasn't that this was a sudden accident or a single act. It was that Emanuel was a victim of sustained child abuse over a period of time. The injuries pointed to a pattern.
And the false police report charge.
That underscores the premeditation, the planning involved in the cover-up. It wasn't just panic, it was a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators. As former Detective Phil Waters put it in your sources, their mirrored stories showed coordination. Both were culpable, both responsible for pushing that false narrative.
Which solidified the state's case that they shared responsibility for the whole tragedy.
Exactly. The foundation of the abduction story crumbled almost immediately under scrutiny.
This whole situation becomes even more, I guess, frustrating and tragic when you dig into Jake Harrow's background.
Yeah.
It turns out Emanuel's death wasn't the first time Jake had severely harmed an infant. We have to talk about that 2018 conviction.
Yeah, this part it's incredibly difficult because it points to what looks like a catastrophic failure in the system. Years before Emanuel was even born, back in 2018, Jake was convicted, California Penal Code, for causing severe bodily harm to his own infant daughter.
How old was she?
Only 10 weeks old at the time.
10 weeks. And severe bodily harm. That sounds incredibly serious.
It is. The details investigators found when they reopened that case file pointed to significant injuries. Injuries consistent with violent handling or shaking. It was not minor.
Okay, so convicted of causing severe bodily harm to a 10-week-old baby. What was the sentence? What was the judicial outcome for Jake Harrow back then?
This is the part that's just shocking in hindsight. He received a suspended sentence and probation. He didn't serve time in state custody.
Wait, suspended for that level of harm to an infant.
Suspended sentence and probation. Commentators looking back quite rightly called it a missed intervention, a massive one. You know, the thinking behind leniency sometimes involves rehabilitation or trying to keep families together, but...
But in a case of violent infant abuse.
Exactly. In this specific context, it meant a proven perpetrator, someone convicted of severely harming a baby, was allowed back into the community, and eventually, tragically, had access to another vulnerable child. The system, it seems, prioritized leniency, perhaps misguidedly, over protection. And years later, well, we see the result.
So when investigators reopened that 2018 file after Emanuel disappeared, what patterns jumped out at them? How did the past connect to the present?
They saw what they described as a behavioral blueprint. You had instability, you had impulsive rage, and crucially, a complete refusal to accept responsibility for the harm he'd caused back in 2018.
How so?
He apparently minimized his role, deflected blame, tried to explain it away, and ultimately he served no real time for severely injuring his daughter. This inability or refusal to internalize accountability. Investigators saw that as the single biggest predictor of future violence.
So when they charged him with Emanuel's murder, they weren't just looking at the final act in August 2025.
No, they were prosecuting a pattern of unchecked volatility that the system had failed to stop years earlier.
Let's talk about the specific legal framework for the murder charge. Penal Code 187. If the death likely occurred during sustained abuse, not necessarily a single planned moment, how does the state prove the intent needed for murder? The malice aforethought.
That's a really important legal distinction. We need to talk about express versus implied malice. Express malice is, planning the death beforehand, thinking about it, intending it.
Which might be hard to prove in an ongoing abuse situation.
Right. So in cases like this involving ongoing severe child abuse, the prosecution argues for implied malice aforethought. They don't need to prove Jake woke up one day and decided, today I'm going to kill Emanuel.
So what do they need to prove for implied malice?
They proved that his actions over time, the sustained mistreatment, the pattern of physical assault reflected in that other charge, Penal Code 273 for endangers a minor, showed such a profound, reckless disregard for the basic safety and life of that infant, that death was a foreseeable, almost inevitable consequence. The sustained abuse itself becomes the proof of the malicious intent required for murder.
Okay, that clarifies the legal strategy. Now let's narrow the focus to that critical time window investigators identified. August 5th to August 14th, 2025. This 9-day period is when they believe Emanuel likely died from his injuries.
Yes, the DA was quite clear on this. They stated that Emanuel's injuries appeared chronic. They reflected a severe pattern over time, not just one single blow or incident,
Meaning his health would have been declining.
rapidly declining during those 9 days. He would have shown clear signs of distress, needing medical attention, attention that was never sought. And that's key.
The lack of seeking help.
Yes. Instead of trying to save him, it appears their focus shifted entirely to how they were going to conceal his death.
And the evidence inside their home you mentioned earlier, it contradicted the abduction story. What did they find?
The forensic search of their residence uncovered some really chilling details. Officers noted disturbed bedding, which might indicate some kind of struggle or event, but also cleaning supplies, disinfectants left out, open, accessible,
Suggesting a cleanup.
suggesting a cleanup. But perhaps the most haunting detail was the crib. It was described as completely untouched, sterile, lacking any of the normal signs of daily infant life. No stray wipes, no dirty blankets, no lingering baby smell.
Empty and clean.
Empty and unnaturally clean. It gave investigators the strong impression that Emanuel hadn't been in that crib for days. Their conclusion was that he likely died there, in the home, during that August 5th to 14th window, and that his parents then began a frantic, but also calculated effort to scrub the scene and prepare their false abduction narrative for the public.
Let's talk about Rebecca Harrow. She presents, I think, the most complex psychological puzzle in this whole case. On one hand, she's presented as the tearful mother, the victim in that parking lot story.
Right, that was the facade.
But on the other hand, the evidence shows she was an active participant in concealing her son's death. It's this duality, isn't it? Potentially a victim herself, yet also clearly culpable.
Absolutely. And her behavior at that initial press conference became Exhibit A for investigators questioning her story. She stood there, silently next to Jake, nodding along as he spoke, reinforcing his words.
With that black eye strategically visible.
Exactly. While she might have looked like a victim in shock to some, law enforcement interpreted her silence, her nodding, her lack of eye contact, not as paralysis, but as signs of coordinated, premeditated staging. She was anchoring the lie.
How do we reconcile that? Her silence, her compliance with the horrific crime she was helping to cover up.
This is where the expert analysis in your sources really diverges. One perspective, mentioned by private investigator Emanuel Gomez, talks about emotional entrapment. He used terms like Stockholm Syndrome or mental confinement.
What's the theory there?
The theory posits that Rebecca might have been protecting Jake, or maybe protecting herself from Jake, out of intense fear, manipulation, maybe some kind of twisted loyalty. Given his history of violence, the idea is she felt trapped between the awful truth of what happened to Emanuel and the power dynamic with her volatile partner.
Is Stockholm Syndrome the right lens? I mean, critics would argue it potentially minimizes her agency. She wasn't just passive, she actively participated in a huge tactical lie, a lie that wasted critical search time.
That's the core of the counter-argument, and it's a powerful one. PI Erica Morris, for example, strongly rejected the simple victim narrative. She argued Rebecca's lies were tactical, not just born of fear, but also of calculated self-preservation.
Morris's point was about the impact of those lies, right?
Yes. Morris emphasized that every single moment Rebecca spent upholding the fake abduction story was a moment stolen from the possibility, however slim, of finding Emanuel. That carries a heavy moral weight, a practical culpability that's hard to just explain away with psychological theories.
And then there was former detective Phil Waters. He focused less on psychology and more on the sheer coordination between Jake and Rebecca.
Waters' perspective was very direct. He said their mirrored defenses demonstrated coordination. They told the exact same, elaborate, and ultimately unbelievable story. To him, that unity wasn't proof of coercion.
It was proof of
Complicity, shared knowledge, or shared guilt in the cover-up. He believed they crossed a line together when they decided to invent the abduction story, and they were both responsible for maintaining it.
And bizarrely, this performance, this united front, it continued even after they were arrested.
It did. Even from custody, Rebecca kept up the public persona, saying things like, "I will not give up on my baby," trying to maintain that image of the searching mother.
While Jake
continued his denials, but he also made a point of defending Rebecca to the media, saying things like, "She is a beautiful woman, the media is killing her," insisting on her innocence.
So even when separated, their statements were still weaponing that same central lie.
Exactly. Reinforcing each other's fictional roles long after the physical evidence had completely dismantled their story. That sustained collusion, that mirroring, really speaks volumes about the level of coordination right from the start.
Okay, so the abduction story collapses. The focus then shifts entirely to finding Emanuel, finding his remains. And Jake's actions right after they made that false report. They seem to show a very cold, calculated effort to get rid of evidence.
Yes, the timing here is crucial. This wasn't panic before the report. This was disposal after the staged plea on August 14th. Investigators pulled surveillance footage from the Beaumont area.
And it showed him doing what?
It captured him getting rid of multiple trash bags at different locations. He also made a distinct stop at a donation center.
What was in the bags? Did they figure that out?
They did. Investigators later confirmed the items discarded included things like baby clothes, some specific toys Emanuel was known to have, and, significantly, feeding bottles.
Discarding feeding bottles, that feels particularly intentional. It's not just hiding general evidence. It's like trying to erase the child's daily existence.
It really speaks to a state of mind that's less about frantic panic and more about methodical erasure. Experts analyzing this called it an effort to cleanse the timeline. He was trying to eliminate objects that could tie Emanuel to the home during a specific period or reveal anything about the timing of his death.
So he gathers these things, drives away from their immediate area.
Right. Uses public dumpsters, donation bins, making the evidence trail as scattered and hard to follow as possible. It shows a clear escalation from just cleaning up inside the house the disinfectants to actively trying to erase evidence out in the world.
This deliberate attempt to erase everything leads us to the next phase, the alleged jailhouse admission. Investigators use something called a Perkins operation. Can you explain what that is?
Sure. A Perkins operation is an undercover tactic. Law enforcement places an undercover officer, or sometimes a reliable informant who's working with them, into the same cell or close proximity as a suspect who's in custody.
End goal.
The goal is to elicit candid statements, information the suspect might not give during a formal interrogation. The key is that the suspect doesn't know they're talking to law enforcement or an agent of the state.
Which means their usual Miranda rights.
Don't necessarily apply in the same way, as long as it's not a formal interrogation setting. The suspect is talking freely, not under direct questioning pressure from someone they know as police. It's a risky tactic, but sometimes crucial when a suspect clams up officially.
And sources, like the reporter Brian Anton you mentioned, claimed Jake did talk during this operation. He made some kind of admission.
That's what the sources reported. But it wasn't a clear, straightforward confession. It was more like fragments, contradictory fragments, actually.
Like what?
Well, one version reported was that Jake acknowledged killing Emanuel and putting the body in the trash. Another, conflicting account, suggested he said he accidentally rolled over on the child in bed and then panicked and buried the body.
Those are very different scenarios.
Very different. And that contradiction is pretty typical in these situations. Suspects often test out different versions, maybe trying to find one that sounds less culpable, trying to gauge reactions. But even those fragmented, conflicting statements were incredibly valuable.
How so?
Because they provided geographic clues. The trash element pointed towards the landfill system, connected to the Beaumont disposal. The burial element shifted focus towards remote areas.
But then the district attorney came out publicly and denied there was a formal confession. They called the media reports misinformation. Why do that if the info was useful?
That often comes down to legal strategy and admissibility in court. The DA was likely denying a formal, signed, recorded confession that would stand up easily at trial. Jailhouse admissions from informants can face tough challenges from the defense about the informant's credibility, the context, audio quality, if any exists, whether it was truly voluntary.
So useful for intelligence, maybe not for court.
Exactly. Even if legally shaky for a conviction, that information was gold for the investigation. It helped them make sense of other evidence, like Jake's truck's GPS data. That data apparently showed some unusual late-night travel patterns, heading precisely towards that rugged, remote terrain near Moreno Valley.
Which corroborated the burial fragment of his alleged admission.
Correct. It helped investigators triangulate and focus their search efforts.
And that intelligence seems to have led directly to that very unusual operation on August 24th, 2025, when they took Jake, dressed in a prison uniform, out to the Moreno Valley Badlands.
Yeah. That was a highly unusual move, a sort of last-ditch effort, really, by law enforcement. They hoped that bringing him to the potential area might break his silence, maybe trigger a memory, get him to point to a specific location.
But it didn't work out that way.
Not according to the analysis from experts like former FBI agent Bobby Chacon. He watched Jake's behavior during that escorted search and concluded it was pure performance.
Performance how?
Jake was apparently gesturing vaguely, pointing towards large, nonspecific hillsides and canyons, never honing in on a precise spot. Ciccone described him as appearing detached, almost like he was playing a role for the cameras and the officers.
Why perform if he genuinely didn't know the exact spot? Or if he did?
Ciccone suggested a few possibilities. Maybe Jake was just simulating cooperation, trying to look helpful to potentially gain some advantage later in court. Or maybe he truly didn't know the exact spot. Perhaps he drove the route, but someone else did the final disposal, or it was dark and he was disoriented. Or maybe he just couldn't recall precisely where among those vast, rugged hills.
Regardless, the outcome was.
Inconclusive, frustratingly so. That steep, brush-covered canyon, ideal for hiding something, it just remained silent, holding on to secrets that, it seems, only Jake could truly reveal.
Okay, let's shift focus now to the courtroom. The indictment filed in Riverside County against both Jake and Rebecca Harrow. You said it was structured meticulously, aiming to form an unbroken narrative of intent and concealment.
That's right. The prosecution laid out 3 key charges that work together.
Can you recap those for us?
Sure. First, Penal Code 187, which is murder with malice aforethought. Second, Penal Code 273, endangering a minor. This reflects the sustained mistreatment, the pattern of abuse. And third, filing a false police report.
And how do they interlock?
Well, the 273 charge, the child endangerment based on sustained abuse, provides the evidentiary backbone for the 187 murder charge. It establishes the implied malice we talked about, proving the death resulted from that pattern of violence and neglect.
Got it. And the false report charge.
That highlights the cover-up. It underscores the calculation, the premeditation involved after Emanuel's death. So, when you put all 3 together, they paint this comprehensive picture. A crime that started with abuse, led to death, and culminated in a deliberate, coordinated concealment effort.
Now, the most surprising twist, legally speaking, came from Jake Harrow. He entered a straight plea. Can you explain for listeners why that's so unusual and what it signifies?
It's quite rare, especially in a murder case. The straight plea means Jake pleaded guilty to all the charges, exactly as filed, without any kind of plea bargain or deal negotiated with the district attorney's office. He just walked in and pleaded guilty to the judge.
What does that signal to legal experts like the former prosecutor David Bruno mentioned in the sources?
Bruno interpreted it as a very clear sign. It meant the evidence against Jake was simply overwhelming. So strong that the defense likely felt they had no strategy left, no credible way to challenge the facts at trial. Pleading straight was essentially an acceptance of the inevitable conviction. It avoids the spectacle and risk of a trial.
But strategically, what did Jake gain by doing this? He still accepted a life sentence.
He preserved his silence. That's the key strategic game. By taking a straight plea, he avoided the conditions that usually come with a plea bargain.
Like having to cooperate.
Exactly. A negotiated plea deal, especially in a case like this, would almost certainly have required him to cooperate fully. That means revealing the location of Emanuel's body, providing details about the crime, and potentially testifying against Rebecca.
But the straight plea let him avoid all that.
Yes. It allowed him to accept the conviction, but retain absolute control over the crucial narrative details, the how, the when, the where of Emanuel's death and disposal. He essentially traded the risk of trial for the certainty of conviction while keeping his secrets locked down.
So what's the sentencing outlook for Jake, given this plea?
Well, the Penal Code 187 murder charge carries a mandatory minimum sentence in California of 25 years to life. But given all the aggravating factors here...
Like Emanuel's extreme youth, the pattern of abuse under the 273 charge.
Exactly. And critically, his prior conviction for abusing his daughter back in 2018. All of that leads legal experts to expect the judge will impose a sentence leaning towards the maximum end of that range. He'll likely only become eligible for parole consideration after serving maybe 35, even 40 years.
And even then?
Even then, under California law, his continued refusal to disclose the location of Emanuel's body will be a significant factor weighed against him by the parole board every single time he comes up for review. It essentially guarantees he serves the maximum possible time. His silence ensures his continued incarceration.
Okay, so Jake's path is set. But Rebecca's legal situation is separate and still evolving. Judge Gary Polk is overseeing this complex sort of split process.
That's right. Her case is much more dynamic. Her future path really hinges entirely on one thing: her level of cooperation moving forward.
What are her options?
Her defense seems to be leaning towards that idea of coercion or diminished control, the psychological entrapment theory we discussed. If she chooses to fully cooperate now, provide truthful testimony about what happened, who did what, and crucially, where Emanuel might be.
Prosecutors might offer a deal.
They've indicated a willingness, yes. If she provides substantial cooperation, her charge could potentially be reduced. Maybe dropped from murder down to Penal Code 273, the child endangerment charge related to the abuse and cover-up.
What kind of sentence would that carry?
Still significant, likely exceeding 15 years. But it acknowledges her complicity without holding her fully responsible for the murder itself, assuming she can convince them Jake was the primary actor and she was coerced or controlled.
And if she doesn't cooperate, if she continues the denial, sticks to the original story, or obstructs the investigation?
Then she faces full exposure to the same Penal Code 187 murder charge that Jake pleaded guilty to. Judge Polk is carefully managing these two distinct legal narratives, despite the shared tragedy. The pressure on Rebecca right now must be immense.
So she has a critical choice to make.
A choice between potentially decades longer in prison by sticking with Jake's narrative or cooperating for a lesser, though still very long, sentence. Her next major step is the preliminary hearing, which will basically determine if the evidence is strong enough to proceed with the murder charge against her, or if it might be reduced based on any cooperation she offers.
Which brings us back to the most painful, unresolved part of this entire case: the search for Emanuel. Investigators seem to have focused on two main potential recovery zones, right? And each suggests something different about the disposal.
Yeah, it's like the geography reflects the conflicting possibilities in the killer's mind. The first zone is the Beaumont landfill system.
Right.
This aligns with that disposal in the trash fragment from the alleged jailhouse admission, and also with the surveillance footage of Jake dumping trash bags in Beaumont after the false report. If he simply put Emanuel's remains in with a regular household refuse.
It would end up processed through the Beaumont waste transfer system and ultimately buried in the landfill.
Exactly. It represents impulsivity, maybe speed, a desire for finality, just making it disappear into the system. It's a practical, if horrifying, solution for quick erasure.
And the second zone?
That's the Morito Valley Canyon corridor, the rugged area along Highway 60 where they took Jake for that escorted search.
What does that location suggest?
That suggests something more deliberate, maybe more symbolic, choosing a remote, wild place for concealment. It implies taking more time, more risk, perhaps a desire to hide the body somewhere seen as untraceable rather than just letting it get buried in refuse. It's concealment without necessarily a lot of pre-planning, just using the landscape.
So quick disposal versus deliberate concealment. That duality makes the search incredibly complex.
Immensely complex. And it's compounded exponentially by the environment itself. The high desert of Riverside County presents massive challenges for recovery.
What are investigators like the CSI Lisa Black mentioned in the sources up against out there?
The environmental barriers are just brutal. Black highlighted, first, the climate. The heat in the high desert accelerates decomposition incredibly fast. For a small infant's remains, the window for detection for finding anything substantial shrinks dramatically, maybe from months down to just weeks.
And the terrain itself?
It's rocky, uneven, difficult to access, hard to excavate without disturbing huge areas. Searching those canyons is slow, painstaking work, often requiring heavy machinery, which itself can complicate things.
Then there's the wildlife factor.
A huge factor. Coyotes, vultures, other scavengers, they are naturally drawn to remains and can disturb and scatter them over a very wide area very quickly.
Meaning they aren't even looking for an intact body at this point.
Almost certainly not. The search has shifted entirely. They're now looking for microtraces. Tiny bone fragments, maybe synthetic fibers from clothing or a blanket, residual chemicals from decomposition, maybe tool marks in the soil if burial occurred. It's requiring forensic science to essentially replace visibility with inference. They're looking for anomalies, for disruptions in the natural environment.
Given all of that, the time elapsed, the harsh environment, the scattering, the deliberate obstruction by Jake, what's the realistic probability of actually finding Emanuel?
The investigators quoted in your sources put it bluntly. The probability of a successful recovery now rests somewhere near 20%.
20%, that's devastatingly low.
It reflects the immense difficulty, the terrain, the decomposition, the potential dispersal. All those factors weigh heavily against success.
And you mentioned earlier that this already low probability hinges entirely on one single variable.
It does. That 20% figure, low as it is, probably assumes no help from Jake. Any chance of significantly increasing those odds of actually finding Emanuel depends entirely on Jake providing truthful cooperation.
Meaning specific information.
Precise, geographically accurate information about where he left Emanuel. Information he has very deliberately withheld up to this point. His absolute silence is the final barrier. It's the last form of control he exerts over Emanuel, over Rebecca, over the investigation, over the possibility of closure for everyone else involved.
So the longer he stays silent,
More the environment works against the search. The probability just keeps collapsing under what scientists might call entropy. The natural processes erase the evidence bit by bit. Justice, in the sense of finding Emanuel, remains indefinitely paralyzed by his silence.
that's an incredibly difficult reality to face at the end of this.
It really is. And this case forces us to ask that haunting question again. How did this happen again? You look back at the leniency Jake Harrow received in 2018.
The suspended sentence after severely harming his daughter.
Right. That decision, that systemic failure to hold him accountable then, arguably created the opening, the structural gap that allowed this second irreversible tragedy years later. It's a stark reminder of the potential cost of misplaced leniency in cases of proven violence against children.
And the crime itself, as we've unpacked, was just layers upon layers. It moved from that sustained, implied malice of the abuse to the cold calculation and coordination of the cover-up. A cover-up exposed not by a confession, but by those quiet contradictions. The timing of the bruise, the clean crib, the mirrored stories that Detective Phil Waters highlighted as proof of shared guilt.
It really was a shared performance of guilt, it seems. And now the search for justice for Emanuel isn't just playing out in the courtroom where the legal process grinds forward. It continues perhaps futilely out there in the physical landscape, the Badlands, the landfill.
Which leaves us with a final, troubling thought.
Yeah. If, as the DA asserted, and the evidence suggests, both parents were culpable for this murder, what does it truly mean for our sense of justice when the final, most fundamental form of closure, finding the victim, allowing for a proper burial, giving some peace to the family, is deliberately held hostage? Held hostage by one parent's calculated absolute silence. That final piece of knowledge, it remains buried with Emanuel, ensuring the punishment inflicted extends far beyond prison walls into the perpetual agony of not knowing.